I'm going to begin with a little anecdote, which is about mountains. Really, the train ride from Vienna to Zurich is about 8 hours long, but it takes you only about 20 minutes before, let's say, the mountains encompass you, before they surround you, demand your attention, make you turn your neck, change your point of view, as they did to me when I took that train ride about a year and a half ago. So they change you, and they too transform the mountains. As you head out south of Vienna, they are low, curved, and green. As you reach Innsbruck or St. Anton, they are tall, rocky, white. And as you approach Zurich, their shape becomes jagged, and they are towering. The water. At first, the mountains are bordered by fields, then they become neighbored by trees and forests, before finally being encompassed by ponds, creeks, and lakes. Indeed, mountains, like all other landscapes, come in many sizes, in many shapes, and so do their surroundings. Clouds, villages, valleys, all add to the mountains, making these life terrains so scenic. Like many others, they always fascinated me, these mountains. They did so when I was skiing with my father, who I think is here somewhere, when I was watching Tour de France in the summer with my mother, when I was watching Astrid Lindgren movies with my brother or friends, or years later when I went on a holiday in Sicily with a girlfriend from France who was little impressed when I told her we should try to climb the island's mountain, probably her considering it a sort of naive, natural exoticism of somebody who lived all his life in one of the flattest countries of the world. But why did they fascinate me? Why do they fascinate us, these mountains? Was it simply that I wanted to conquer them, transcend them as some kind of modern Nietzschean figure? I don't think so. In fact, I think it was probably more the opposite. If anything, I found comfort, I found wonder in these mountains, precisely because they were greater, because they were grander than me, both in terms of physicality and temporality. If I wanted to transcend anything, it was probably less about going beyond my own human limits, rising above nature, than it was about transcending the present by experiencing that thing, the mountains, which had already been there before me, and which would be there after me. That remains probably one of the reasons why I am obsessed with mountains. If they generated a certain sense of awe, astonishment, it's perhaps because they continue to symbolize sort of a greater constant, an eternal, something permanent, hereby providing a sort of cosmological axis, linking our own limited human historicity to something transgressing it. The problem is, I thought as I was riding through the Swiss landscape, that it's no longer the same mountains. A few days prior to my train ride, the Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarti had reminded me so when sharing a draft of a new article he was working on, in which he draws on Ludwig Wittgenstein, asserting that, and I quote, mountains used to be part of our inherent background, a part of the givenness of the world, just like the rivers and its seas, seasons, trees, plants, and coastlines. The mountains, in other words, through Wittgenstein, they were just there, motionless in the background, everlasting, as I said, natural constants, contrasting a human world of flux, or in flux. But today, these mountains are no longer just there. They too are in a state of flux, and not just because the forms there appear and change as you ride through the landscape from Austria to Switzerland, but because they are being rapidly, fiercely, intensely transformed by climate change, human-induced climate change, hereby threatening the very givenness of the given, the very givenness of the world, that Wittgenstein saw them as emblematically exemplifying. An Austrian scientist had told me a couple of days before that the hikers it's called, the local inhabitants of these landscapes were beginning to observe these processes that scientists have now been studying for years. Diminishing of snow, loss of glacier mass, impacts on water cycles, biodiversity ecosystems, increase in landslides, flash floods are just some of the ways that mountains today are currently being transformed by us human beings. Transformations that in the coming century we know now will probably only intensify. So much for mountains as a constant in a world of flux, so much for these rocky landscapes as an inherited background. Instead, again, the givenness of the world, as I said, is giving away each day with a new record-breaking temperature measured on this earth. What happens then when the eternal turns transient, when the constant becomes inconstant, or when the inherited backcloth now appears as slowly being disinherited? What happens with that couldn't change, changes? What are your coordinates individually, collectively, when the persisting ceases to persist? I don't know. And I don't know as well if I like green mountains or white mountains the best, but I was passing through the city of Innsbruck, one of the many places where the ski resorts are on their way to die out. I certainly knew that I wasn't preferring disappearing mountains. Imagine that as an image of the future, riding through the mountains in a train, passing one abandoned ski village after the other, left behind as an Atlantis in the sky, lost to collective hubris, an architecture of the past, remnants, so to say, of a world that used to be. Now, a little more than a year later, I once again found myself surrounded by mountains, this time on a boat ride with friends through Killary Fjord, boarding in the village of Leenane in the west of Ireland. As the boat set out, engine gained speed, the hills of County Mayo, the hills of Region Connemara slowly rose on either side, growing taller the farther we moved from land. Mountains, sky and sea, the rocks, the luck and me, as Georgie Jessen, the poet, says. All of these moved by merged, mirrored in each other, a circular experience, for sure, a circular experience, even more so when the boat tour guide begins chronicling how a certain philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in 1948, in fact, spent several months living here in a small cottage just a few kilometers away. Escaping Cambridge, which can be, I guess, a very boring place, and seeking solitude in all these landscapes, Wittgenstein found Connemara, and I quote, to be the last pool of darkness in Europe, the last place where he could think far beyond the noise and the flux in the midst of the quiet, everlasting mountains. Would he still have found it so today when the given, as he called it, is no longer given? Or would he have heard in these mountains a scream unsettling his rhythm of thought, knowing that these mountains of Western Ireland too are heavily affected by climate change? Once again, I don't know. In any case, in any way, these mountains may have moved him. Wittgenstein actually should have known that the given was not always given when it comes to landscapes. He already did know, at least, about these mountain landscapes being ravished by humans, because during his stay, we know, Wittgenstein's obsession with language led him to record how the Irish people fought to restore the Gaelic native tongue stolen by the Irish or by the British imperial colonizers in the same process as they seized their land. A simultaneous grab of land and language, not that unlike how some of us today struggle to find the adequate words to express, to sense the synchronous shift of a soil beneath us and certain existential uncertainties within us. I know this because a few days before I arrived in Ireland, my friend Conor Deegan had told me that these hills that I was sailing through on a boat were ravished by the British. The marks are still to be seen in the land itself and in the minds and the hearts of the people. During the Great Irish Famine, to escape the British colonial annihilation of lands, of lives, of livelihoods, thousands of people set out to America from the very fjord, same very fjord as I was gonna have to do like this, that I was sailing through, with the majestic mountains sometimes being the last thing that people would see before leaving their homes, their habitats, before leaving their heimats. To hell or to Connacht, Cromwell's soldiers used to say, and the traces of this remnant inferno still persists today in the natural landscapes, in the existential life terrains of the Irish. And it is this story, and the story of how it has shaped music, Irish music, that Conor Deegan is here to tell us about today. When we initiated this lecture series last year, we did it with the goal of collectively reflecting on, investigating landscapes as ecological, architectural, political, cultural, and again existential phenomena, how they have changed, shape, how they have been depicted, theorized throughout history, and how they are currently, again, changing, how they are metamorphosing, and how they are in need to be rethought, represented, re-represented, and redrawn. By bringing together a whole gamut of leading theorists and practitioners, the series aims here at providing students, academics, hopefully some from the wider public as well, with a hybrid range of historical and contemporary perspectives of how to understand the transforming character, the complex notion of landscapes, how to portray them, how to map them again, how to understand what they consist of and what it means to inhabit them, and as we'll see today, the many ways of how to defend them. As we saw last semester, artists have always been nothing less but monumental in thinking about, exploring and shaping our understanding of nature, of landscapes, and of life terrains. Whereas Frédéric Aitoiti and Duncan Evenou reminded us how performance and how theater is of crucial importance for investigating the changing shapes of territories, then the painter George Rui afterwards reminded us how the visual arts, and more specifically painting, historically has been essential in thinking about exploring and reshaping, recomposing even our understanding of landscapes and our life terrains. Finally, summing up, Emanuele Coccia reminded us that if artists are so crucial when facing the metamorphosis of landscapes, it's because their work has always dealt with making people sense, feel, perceive that which they did not before, something crucial, he argued, in our time's crisis of sensibilities. Now, Conor Deegan is not in theater, he is not a painter, he makes music. What does that mean? Well, if we once again return to Wittgenstein, then if we speak of music in terms of understanding, then understanding a musical motive or theme is akin to understanding a sentence. And through his creation of such motives, such themes, as a songwriter and as a musician, Conor Deegan is then certainly also in the field of making people sense, feel, and perceive that which they did not before, no matter if we speak about modern life, landscapes, love, longing, or belonging. Currently based in London, Deegan was born in '93 in Castlebar, County Mayo, where he was raised, close to where my boat ride took place, on the other side, 40 kilometers away or something, where he lived until he attended BIMM Institute, a musical college, where he met Carlos, Curly, Tom, and Grian, with whom he would go on to found the band Fontains D.C. in 2014, a band which 10 years later, 4 records later, are among our time's most celebrated, epoch-defining, I dare to say, and critically acclaimed guitar bands, receiving several awards, including 2 times Brit Awards International Group of the Year, NME Award called Best Band in the World, the Rolling Stones Magazine Album of the Year, just as well as Fontains D.C. have twice been nominated for a Grammy. Or as Diego once put it on a short-lived dating app profile, that he was a double Grammy loser. We did the app together, so I'm allowed to say that. Diego will be able to describe his own records better than I, but in terms of life terrains, in terms of landscapes, it strikes me that each of these records investigate a certain relation to the land, the soil, and place. Dockrell was a raw, clear-cut depiction of Dublin cityscapes. The record that came afterwards, A Hero's Death, dealt with loss of place, loss of belonging whilst being on the road. Third album, Skinty Fia, investigated what it means to be Irish away from home in London. And finally, Romance unfolded as a sort of planetary album, I would argue. An album like no other album that I've heard has managed to capture the many disoriented, the many fragmented, the many contradictory and often tormented affects that so defines the times we live in. In the book Land Sickness, under the term New Existentialism, I myself tried to investigate how the moral and emotional life terrains of human beings in a time of climate change is metamorphosing, how it's splintering. But as I mentioned before, of course, the power of art to not only transform, but also to mirror affects once again proved stronger than any philosophy. As I sometimes say, then as every seamstress knows, if you want to fix a broken piece of cloth, it might be a good idea to find out how it shattered in the first place. And probably the same thing counts for our existential fabrics, for the existential landscapes of the human being. And if so, if I'm not wrong about that, romance might not be a bad place to start. If not for hope, then perhaps for soothing or for romance. After all, as anthropologists and philosophers Eduardo Viveros de Castro and Deborah Danowski taught us, there are many different ways to inhabit the end of times, to inhabit a time where the given is no longer given. If Diego, Carlos, Curly, Tom, and Grian so magnificently has managed to translate the affects, the feelings of it into music, it might be because they come from a place called Ireland, where the end of times happened with the British imperial rule colonizing their life terrains, and where the wounds of this lie deep in their history, in their culture, in their hearts, their minds, and their souls. As I already alluded to previously, this is the topic that Diego will talk on today, how such wounds have manifested themselves artistically, and more precisely, how previously colonized landscapes historically, contemporarily plays a role in a tradition of Irish music that Diego himself is one of today's most important hearers and practitioners of. A question I cannot think of anybody more fitting to enlighten us on than him. So welcome to Aarhus School of Architecture. Welcome back to the Live Terrains lecture series. And please help me give a warm welcome to one of my closest friends, Conor Deegan from Castlebar, Mayo. Thank you. Is it working?
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi everyone, how are you? Thanks so much, Nikolai, for having me here today, and to all of the audience as well. Really excited to be speaking to you. Yeah, as Nikolai introduced, this place is really literally like 4 kilometers, 5 kilometers away from where I grew up in Ireland. I'm from Mayo, and it's a place that holds a lot of history, even though it seems like it's completely empty. For example, this is my farm. This is my family farm. And back in before the British, the land in Ireland was kind of organised in such a way that people shared the land. It was called commonage, And once the country was taken back from the British, land was given out, was subdivided, but it was given back to the people. And actually, the history with my family with this farm was that after the revolution, my family was given this farm if they moved down the road. So my great grandparents, who were like very poor farmers, got in their tin cart with their donkey and went 30 kilometers down the road so they could get this farm. And yeah, as if you can actually see it, obviously it's very typically Irishly cloudy. But if you look far up those hills, you can kind of see these ridges. So you can kind of see these ridges. And I kind of was always curious about them. They seemed so unnatural when I was a child. I'd be running around in them. I'm like, what the hell is this? But as it turns out, they're literally like a relic of the era of the potato in Ireland, because they're the ridges, they're the marks, they're like the scars in the land of our history in a way. And yeah, it's a thing. But so when I think about Ireland, I don't just see this place. Like I also hear the sounds. I want to show you a little bit of that. So this is like a pub in Limerick in Ireland, Dolan's pub. It's a very well-known pub, and it's where they'd often have Irish song sessions of music and this kind of thing. Okay. Yeah, so I think that we can all hear there that there's a mixture of like major and minor keys, and it's kind of a mixture of melancholy and triumphant, I would say. I don't think it's best described by like artists or by historians, but just by like the very most commonplace of occurrences and actions. Like it's in the excuse me, it's in the wind that comes off the Atlantic like a sigh from a parent that you're not old enough to understand. In the way the rain excitedly claps down on old slate roofs, like a man tapping his car steering wheel when he hears his son, who always struggled, met a good girl, and she said yes. It's in the low hum of a pub before the song session starts. It's in the way you recognize a look from someone who's about to give you bad news, though you've never seen that look before, and how everything goes so soundless. I suppose then it's a sound and a soundlessness, carrying both defiance and joy. Defiance and sorrow, joy and memory. And that tonality is older than any of us, like any Irish person, any of the people here. It comes from the land itself and what it remembers and what it reminds us of and what we've almost forgotten. Colonization is, to be frank, a well-known story of Ireland's history. Like I'm sure you've all kind of in some way heard about it. And I'm not entirely sure of what you might think of it, but I'd like to tell you about it a bit. And hopefully with that, maybe through the exploration of this, like kind of heal in some way a part of myself, like that voiceless Irish part that wants the story of Ireland to be known outside of Ireland. So Britain didn't simply just redraw the borders of Ireland, it redrew its sense of self, that sense of self that was not just nurtured by but also educated by the land. Our cultural and spiritual practices were drawn from the land. I often thought to myself when I heard one of the old men in the west of Ireland speak Irish that it didn't sound so much like language, but it actually sounded more like peat bog being turned in the summertime. More like big glass bottles of milk mixed with tea and uncut loaves of bread with butter being brought out to the toiling but hearty men by their kind and free wives. So then maybe you understand when I say that the British Empire didn't only just take resources or impose language. It changed the very way the land could sing to us. And it made the land's language sound strange even to our own ears. Oak forests were cut down for the building of colonial ships. The soil was stripped and reorganized for efficiency rather than its stories. Rivers were redirected from their time-honoured groove, and our history and folklore-filled bogs were drained. And beyond all of that, the people were made to see their own home as something to survive against rather than to belong to. And you can still see all of that today. Like if you drive through the west and looked at the hills still empty from the burning of the bush schools, which were the hillside bushes where children were taught to speak Irish in secrecy because the teaching of the language was banned. You can still feel that, and you can see those ridges, as I pointed out, where the crops failed, and they're like the scars of the history of the famine, of the trauma. But what really fascinates me is that out of all of that devastation, out of all of the tracing of the lines of those scars, comes a sound world that endured longer than an empire. And our music, like our folk music, our rebel songs, our lullabies, our laments, became an emotional landscape that we could survive in, even when the physical one was not a place we could. And I think that's one of Ireland's greatest acts of rebellion, is that we turned grief into tonality. We turned the crowding voices of the hungry into a harmony. And we sat with loss, both owning it and defying it with melody. And so this talk, the tonality of Irish landscapes, is about those two things, the land and the sound. How colonization, technology and culture have shaped both our environment and our emotional register. How the fields we walk, the songs we sing, and even the way we speak are all part of the same resonant field. We'll look at how Ireland's trauma collided with the ideals of the Romantic movement in Europe. How while poets like Wordsworth and Whitman were writing about the moral goodness of nature, Ireland was living through its destruction. How the famine turned romantic longing into something darker, something more spiritual and something more defiant. And we'll trace how the inheritance continues today in our folk traditions, our politics, even our relationship with technology and modern life. Because I think every generation faces its own version of colonization. For us, it might have been an empire of soldiers in the past, and it might not be that today, but it might be like an empire of algorithms, you know. I think that old mechanistic mindset of empire and order and progress has just like changed form, and it's still here with us. And when the world tells us to be efficient, productive and reasonable, I just want to ask the question, like, how do we stay human through all of that? All right, so we'll start off with with Romanticism and the Great Hunger. And here's a quote by William Wordsworth. To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran, and much it grieved my heart to think that what man has made of man. And we've got a classic, painting that you might see in any gallery in Europe, by Theodore Géricault, of like this lovely pastoral kind of scene, this kind of fantasy scene in a way, I suppose. When the Great Hunger struck Ireland in the 1840s, Europe was in the full bloom of Romanticism. While famine was plaguing Ireland, elsewhere poets were writing odes to nature's providence, to its fundamental yet inexplicable beauty, to the purity of the human soul when in communion with the natural world. Painters filled their canvases with pastoral life and agrarian life. Philosophers preached of returning to simplicity after the mechanization of the Industrial Revolution. For most of Europe, Romanticism was a kind of longing, a nostalgia for something half lost in the rush toward modernity. But for Ireland, there was no such nostalgia. The grief was not philosophical, it was lived. Nature was still very much the arbiter of a life's continuation for essentially everyone living there. It wasn't a fantasy of like people that were living in the city and dreaming of the way things used to be and the way we could return to. And nature had begun its turn on us, or so it would be said by the British government of that era, to be honest. So I have a few quotes for you. It's like, the cultivation of the earth is the most natural mode of human life, and yet the poorest peasantry in Europe are the Irish. I was daunted by the human chrysalis lying silent before me, a soul that God had abandoned. That's from a guy called Alex de Tocqueville, and it's a journal from 1835 when he visited Ireland. And then here's another one. In a country filled with grass, to see the people perishing for want of food. So we're seeing that perspective of people coming to Ireland and being shocked by what they had seen. But at this point, Ireland was well under British rule and therefore under British control. This is a picture of a very, very bad lad called Charles Trevelyan. Yeah, you might as well substitute his name with the curse in Ireland as far as you're concerned. But the British government of this era saw nature as a moral teacher. The official line from London was, this was the judgment of God. Sir Charles Trevelyan, the man overseeing famine relief, wrote that the famine was the direct stroke of an all-wise providence, a divine mechanism to teach the Irish a lesson. If you can let that one sink in for a second. He believed suffering would improve the Irish character, that hunger would make us rational, industrious and modern. In his mind, famine was not a tragedy, but a reform. This reform came first not as a reform of character, but a reform of the land itself. Potatoes were blighted and gone black. The field was stripped bare of any other crop, and the livestock we reared to be exported daily from Cork and Limerick to England. Even at the height of the famine, Ireland remained a net exporter of food, which is a crazy thing to imagine. I think that the way the history is taught, even in our schools, to be honest, it's always seen as like a massive lack of food rather than what it was actually. The empire guarded these shipments with soldiers while peasants starved in the ditches beside the ports. And there was a logic of empire at the time, what I would say, the mechanistic logic that measured virtue by productivity. And and it wasn't just Trevelyan; it was also the Catholic Church too. And they were both of the idea that the potato blight was some kind of divine intervention, a resetting of Ireland for the betterment of the natural order. And so with this mindset, he enacted policies in 1846, which would make the hunger far worse, but kind of enforcing this like capitalist mode of thought. So he ended government food depots. Like Trevelyan believed that the previous government's policy of supplying cheap food, like Indian cornmeal, was a mistake because it undercut market prices and discouraged private food importation. I don't know, does any of this sound a bit familiar to you with the modern times? His policy aimed to shift responsibility back to the free market and the private sector. And there was also the new Labour Rate Act. This act was intended to provide aid only to the most severely affected areas and to encourage self-sufficiency. Trevelyan's goal was to have labourers return to the fields to harvest their own crops rather than depending on government aid. Kind of sounds like he's trying to encourage like people to have their own startup business, right? When they're starving and stuff. But the actual reality of it was like sending people to work themselves to death, you know. There was a thing called famine roads in Ireland. There were roads, and you can still visit them now today. If you live in the countryside, often you'll see a road, and it just goes to nowhere. They're just built in the hills, and there was people working these roads that weren't connecting to places at all. They were just building them to give them work, and then the amount of money they get wouldn't be enough to actually survive. So they were sent out to work, and yeah, terrible scenario. So what we have here, this is a picture from the Illustrated London News from the era. It's a picture of two Irish peasants, I suppose, of the era of the you know, it was one of the first kind of publicized pieces of what was actually going on, and it was just in that era when people in Britain were starting to see the normal working person in Britain, the working class people, and in America as well, were starting to see what was going on. And the worst affected town, probably the worst affected place in the town of, most affected town in Ireland was Skibbereen in County Cork, where corpses were found lying unburied by the roadside, their faces eaten by rats. One doctor wrote, "The living lay down beside the dying and fell asleep in death." The Illustrated London News published these engravings of the skeleton children and famines collapsing in the mud, and they were extremely shocking to even Victorian England, and we all know what they were up to behind closed doors. But there was a song written about this event named after the town of Skibbereen, and it's attributed to a man called Patrick Carpenter, a native of the place, and to around the year 1868, so about 20 years after this. And so the lyrics would go like, "My son, I loved our native land with energy and pride. Until a blight came on my land, my sheep and cattle died. The rent and taxes were to pay, I could not them redeem, and that's the cruel reason why I left old Skibbereen. Oh, it's well I do remember that bleak December day. The landlord and the sheriff came to drive us all away. They set my roof on fire with their demon yellow spleen, and that's another reason why I left old Skibbereen. Your mother too, God rest her soul, lay on the snowy ground. She fainted o'er in anguish with the desolation round. She never rose but passed away from life to a mortal dream, and found a quiet grave, my boy, in dear old Skibbereen. And you were only 2 years old and feeble was your frame. I could not leave you with your friends. You bore your father's name. I wrapped you in my coat of moor at the dark of night unseen. I heaved a sigh and bid goodbye to dear old Skibbereen. Yeah. And then we see actually coat of moor, for people who aren't maybe not familiar with Gaelic, with Irish, is like a big jacket, so he wrapped him in his big coat. And yet across the sea, the government were still preaching the holiness of non-intervention. To interfere with the market, they said, would be to interfere with God himself. Grain exports continued under armed guard. Public works were shut down and relief was cut. One might say that the famine was where the romantic ideal met its failure. So as I described earlier with the workhouses, this is kind of a scene outside of the workhouse of the people going in to try and even get work, that they could even try and work themselves to death. For while Europe dreamed of the noble peasant and the moral beauty of rural life, Ireland's peasants were being erased. And, the irony is that the leading intellectuals of the era were romanticizing nature, yet allowing for its destruction. So, when the famine's generation of children began to write, they did so with a different relationship to the land. For them, the land was no longer a backdrop to the human dramas. It was actually, the hills and the fields were characters, holding memories too painful for people to speak aloud. That's why so many of our songs are about the land itself, about rivers, fields, and towns. Each place name is sacred. The Fields of Athenry is one of those such songs, and it's an extremely famous song in Ireland. You might have even heard it in an Irish pub if you've been to one before, as I'm sure you have, as a lot of students like. But the Fields of Athenry is not just a lament about one man's exile. It's kind of a hymn to the moral memory of Ireland and of the place. This video that I'm going to show you a clip of, I think is an amazing video. It's a clip of a thing that was organised a few years in Ireland in the town of Athenry, and it's like thousands of people who've come together to sing this song. And I feel like even though it's such a big, obviously huge performance, it still carries that intimacy with it of the story and of the loss. And I feel like it's such a great example of how, the songs are really inherited. They're an inherited culture. And so when we were speaking about something like the tonality of Irish landscapes, it's not just metaphorical. The famine, Romanticism, and colonization intertwined to create an actual sound. A national songbook that through melody and words illustrates our history and spirit. And I think that's perhaps the heart of it, actually, that while the rest of Europe dreamed of escaping the modern world, Ireland used it to survive. Our Romanticism wasn't about returning to nature. It was about staying human in the face of all of what was happening. So let's have a little listen to the Fields of Athenry. Okay, so this is lovely little Athenry somewhere in Ireland, and we have our children here. Okay, I'll skip past this bit.
Prison wall, I heard a young girl calling. Michael, they have taken you away, for you stole your valiant cause, so the young might see the morn. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay. Long lie the field of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was
What I think really is amazing about that song, to be honest, of course, it tells a very sad story of Michael, who's had to steal Trevelyan's corn for his family to survive, and in the act of doing so has committed a crime and is now being sent on a prison ship to Australia, damning himself to a life of imprisonment, but also his family to die. I think what's interesting, though, as well, is that actually the chorus is so joyful and it doesn't blame the land. It sounds like, oh, the fields of Athenry are amazing. It's a very clear memory that the land wasn't to blame. You know, and they talk about the thing that hurts. They still have a reverence for the place where the free birds fly, but they have the worst thing they can say about it is actually how lonely it is there now. Yeah. Okay, how are we feeling? Is it a bit heavy? Are we all right? Okay. Let's see now. How do I do this again? Right. Oh yeah, here we go. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about this mindset stuff. Now, this man here with this fantastic haircut is a man called Jonathan Swift. He's a very famous Irish writer. And okay, so mechanistic empire. When the British brought what the British brought to Ireland wasn't just power; it was method. The empire saw the world as a series of systems to be organized, measured, and improved. That was in faith, reason as religion. That same enlightenment that spoke of liberty and progress also produced a moral coldness, a belief that order itself was good and that those who resisted order were backwards. And Ireland actually became a very early test site for that thinking, and that would then go on to be used in other colonies such as India. I don't know actually if you know this might be a bit of a niche fact, but the idea of boycotting something was actually invented in my hometown in Castlebar. Which is really strange. So there was an English lord there at the time called Sir William asshole. Boycott was his name, and obviously he was charging very extreme rents and such things, and the town were sick of him. So they stopped. They decided to stop dealing with them. So he'd go into the shops, into the pubs, and they wouldn't have him. They wouldn't serve him any pints. They wouldn't give him any bread, and he was sent out. He had to leave the town so he couldn't survive there. And it was actually the Land League that was founded in Castlebar, and that's what they did. And it's amazing that they actually went on to partially use those tactics in India then as a means of resistance. When the English first mapped Ireland in the 16th century, they called it surveying, but to those who lived there, it felt more like dissection. The land was divided into grids and coordinates and given out to English nobility with titles assigned to them of lord or lady. Lord of Lady of a place which had now its native name wiped away and replaced with something British. The oak forests were cleared away, native customs and beliefs about the land with them, and the spiritual connection with the land severed. A country once alive with story and myth became simply another stretch of green to turn for profit. This is where the mechanistic part begins. The empire's great project was to make the organic, the living, obey the linear, to make nature and the people calculable. Jonathan Swift saw it clearly. A century before the famine, he wrote in Gulliver's Travels, "Whoever could make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass to grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before, would deserve better of mankind than the whole race of politicians put together." And he meant it as a mockery, like a satire of the era's utilitarian logic. They thought that which could be improved had moral value. That which could not was useless. The fairy fort, the Irish fairy fort, the bog, even the Irish peasants themselves were all unproductive and therefore expendable. And that was the mindset that allowed Trevelyan and his peers to watch people starve while full carts of food left the island. They believed they were witnessing nature correcting itself. And Ireland at that point was a nation that was not so much a nation, but a malfunctioning system to be reset. And I think that's the true face of the mechanistic empire really, not sadism, but indifference disguised as reason. As Swift said in a modest proposal when he suggested the poor might sell their children for food, "I have been assured by a very knowing American that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food." It was satire, of course, but it's, in some way, at that era, maybe a little bit plausible, And even though, you know, at some point when Ireland did win its independence, the machinery in some way still remained. Our institutions, our schools, our civil service, our courts were modelled on British designs. The hierarchy of church and state mirrored that of empire. We had different masters but same mechanics. The revolution changed the flag but not the buildings. So being an architecture school, I would love if you could tell me which building was in Ireland and which building was in Britain. But I think I proved listen, let's move on a bit to these fellas here. So when you think of rebellion, you might think of gunfire or banners, but for the Irish, rebellion often began in song. That was because, although I'd say the British surely tried this, songs can't be put in handcuffs. Songs cannot have their freedom removed or disguised in some way. Songs could survive even where the Irish language was forbidden, when gatherings were outlawed because free opinion was dangerous. It was the subversive way the Irish learned to express their truth and do it with a willful charm. The pubs became our parliaments, the singers became our man-on-the-street journalists, and the folk tradition became the great record of Irish emotional history, unwritten, ungovernable, but known by heart. So these fellas here are a band called Dubliners. They're one of my favourite bands ever, to be honest. And they're a band of dynamics, you know, they're a band of like the camaraderie and the hangover, the misty-eyed look into the past, but the celebration of the moment. And all the while balancing sincerity and mischievousness in a way that makes you see the young boys in their eyes, behind the layers of years and beards. But all the while they held an unspoken reverence for their inheritance of songs and took no second measure of duty in the act of helping to keep them alive, and what more, actually revived them. When Luke Kelly, the fella on the far left there with the nice ginger hair, sang School Days Over, it became more than a song about a child at work. It became a song about childhood's worth. So we'll get a little clip of it here for you now. Okay, here we go.
School days over, come on then, John. Time to be getting your pit boots on. On with your sark and the moleskin trousers, it's time you were on your way. Time you were learning the pitman's job and earning the pitman's pay.
So what we're being described to us here is like a young man. Well, actually, in this context, it might seem like he's a young man, but this era it was kind of 14-year-old boys who were being sent to work, really. And it might sound like something that's from a completely different era, but actually my own father was sent to work at like 14 as well, because he had so many sisters. He had 10 sisters. But yeah, so I think you know when you hear that voice, to me it sounds like an engine you could recognize on your street at dawn. It's like the pure, undisciplined sound of working class dignity. The boy in the song is barely old enough to leave school, but he's sent off to work in the coal mines. School day's over, come on then, John, time to be getting your pit boots on. It's not a protest song in the usual sense. It doesn't shout, it shows. And in doing so, it protests something much deeper, I think, the quiet acceptance of injustice. In that way, Irish folk music didn't just chronicle rebellion, it taught empathy. It turned individual hardship into collective memory. That's cultural survival to me, because when you sing about pain together, it stops being shame and it starts being solidarity. Might as well just stay on YouTube now. Okay. So, if the Dubliners distilled a sense of belonging from old folk songs for the modern person in Ireland, you know, the rare old times of Dublin and whatever, The Clancy brothers brought it abroad onto across the Atlantic over to American TV. They were 4 Irish emigrants in traditional Aran jumpers, smiling and laughing and singing songs that had once been banned. So this is The Rising of the Moon.
Oh, come tell me, Sean O'Farrell, tell me why you hurry so. Hush me buckle, hush and listen, and his cheeks were all aglow. I bear orders from the captain, make you ready quick and soon. For the pikes must be together by the rising of the moon. By the rising of the moon, by the rising of the moon. For the pikes must be together by the rising of the moon. Oh, then tell me...
Amazing. Fills me with so much pride to see them, to be honest. This is clearly from the 60s. I suppose it's just before they got the colour TVs going. But yeah, it was on one of those late night shows, Ed O'Brien, I think it was called. And I don't know, I think it's pretty incredible to be able to kind of disguise rebellion and that kind of thing as show business, you know, to kind of get that message out there in such a way. It's actually describing the 1798 rebellion in Ireland that actually went through my home county of Mayo as well, and it was assisted by the French. They kind of came in and tried to help us do it, but it only lasted for about 30 days, unfortunately. But I think what we're seeing is, what we're there is amazing, you know. I think that what once had to be whispered behind closed doors is now being broadcast all across America, possibly to like Irish Americans and to more to hear this story, you know. And I think that's how like the idea of rebellion evolved for Irish people. It became a folk story. You know, what happened became folk stories, and then, you know, became a means of expressing a kind of communal pride. And I think folk music in Ireland has always done that. It remembers what official histories tried to forget. You know, a lot of this stuff that I'm talking to you about now, I had to do research about later in life. It wasn't something that I was taught as a child. You know, the famine, the emigration, the failures of our different eras of hegemonic powers, but perhaps most importantly, the lives of the disenfranchised who refused to become poor of spirit. It turned those things into melodies and lyrics so they couldn't be erased. Because I think in a country where speaking the truth was often punished, singing it was a kind of freedom. Even today at a song session you'll feel it, that soundlessness before the song begins, that reverence. It's not just respect for the singer, it's respect for the memory inside the songs as well. Right, so maybe you recognize these fellas here on the left. I'm one of the ones on the left. Maybe you don't recognize me actually. I've changed a bit since then. But yeah, I don't know, is it obvious to you that the influence here, but in the photo even, we were clearly obsessed with the Dubliners of this era in time. And it was amazing to kind of have a band that you could in some way walk the footsteps of, you know. Trying to find that exact doorway was a pain in the hole, to be honest. We didn't manage to find it, but we got something a bit similar. And so I'm going to speak about my own practice for a little bit, my own experience of these kind of things. And with Fontains D.C, like we began as a group of young men in Dublin City. We were young and idealistic, and we found romance together on like the grimy streets of Dublin, where we could literally barely afford to live, because the rents were so high and we had so little money. I actually remember before, me and a couple other band members were so broke we had no money for a beer, and we were actually like going around on the streets just trying to see if we could find people we knew to just kind of get €2 off them or whatever. And we managed to see a guy and we got a £5 off him, which was amazing, because it meant we could get 8 cans of beer from Tesco. And we just drank them on those streets. But it didn't matter any of that like poverty or whatever didn't matter, because we were so filled with the romance towards our city, you know. It made it all feel very poetic. And that's what we initially bonded over, poetry, like. It was something where we were in uni together and we were kind of all going around, and I saw Carlos with a book in his pocket, and I went up and I grabbed it out and I saw it, and it was Walt Whitman. And yeah, I think that's how we initially started talking to each other, but we kind of made these 2 little books of poetry together, Vroom and Winding, and we explored poetry. And the second one was inspired by W.B. Yeats' Winding, actually. And I think with this we kind of found a higher calling of sorts. And it kind of at the time felt at odds with the punk music that we were looking to play, you know. It was like, how do we mix these things together? But we found inspiration in the repetition of poetry and the beats of poetry and the return to the refrains and stuff like this. And yeah, we found a beauty in that noise and a similarity to, in some way, to the streets of Dublin and to its clatter and bang, and the characters as well of Dublin were actually so downtrodden and misfitty and crazy people, to be honest. And we wrote them into our music, you know. I think that first album, Doggerel, really was at once both an archival of a moment in Dublin, but also a snapshot of like our romantic spirits at that time. And we had probably just listened to the Dubliners too much, to be honest. But we found a camaraderie in their music and a simple way of connecting deeply, not just to our fellow countrymen as they are now, but to a life from long ago that had become so storied and misty. I'll tell you an excerpt of Green's words from Dublin City Sky. I was down the bottom half of some old bar in Chinatown. My shoes had brought the rain and soaked the space for looking down. As drunk as love is lethal, I spun a lady round, and I kissed her neath the waking of a Dublin City sky. She threw her shoes into her bag and danced just like a dream. Her face was rubied up like no sun had ever seen. She said I was a phony. I said I could be mean. And I treated her so badly, I made my baby cry. Lovely. You know, that's our album cover for Doggerel there. It was a circus, an Irish circus. But that album, Doggerel, you know, was inspired by an exhibition that I went to on Irish rebel flags. And there was a man giving the tour. It was all these different generations of Irish rebel flags through all of these things that I've talked to you about, the 1798 rebellion, the 1916 rebellion, all of these different things. And but the man who was giving it recited a piece of poetry to me, and it was Doggerel, a piece of like working class poetry. I thought it was amazing. It was about the Irish, or the Dublin Fusiliers in fighting in the Boer War in South Africa, and but it was written from the perspective of a normal Dublin Irish person. And I thought that was so amazing to me, because although I'd always enjoyed poetry, I'd never really seen like poetry that wasn't written by some dude who had like nice parents and a nice house. You know, like obviously W.B. Yeats, as amazing as he is, he's Anglo-Irish, he's middle class, right? He's not like, he's an observer, he's not like super connected to the actual experiences as great as he is. So this idea of like working class poetry was so amazing to me, and I thought that like to set it as an ambition for what that we wanted to do with our first record was really appropriate, you know. So we named it that. I think then in that era, we were still in some way yearning for a Dublin that we could see was changing all around us. The capitalism was coming in, that we were being priced out and all of this. But we wanted to keep the Irish spirit in the face of that form of oppression, you know. I know it wasn't extreme as like the kind of survival that was happening in previous generations. Of course, it wasn't. But you know, we were still in some way, we were extremely broke, working hard to keep our dream alive. And I think that what I can relate there is that the dream was sustaining us, you know. And yeah, so with our second album, A Hero's Death, we'd been displaced from Dublin and we went off onto the road. We never got to go home. We were on tour all of the time. We were still broke, but we were getting free whiskey. We were getting free whiskey, so that was all right. And yeah, it was a period of time where I think, you know, a couple of us, me included, were kind of eating tins of corn from gas stations and tins of olives, which was pretty good way to get on. But the main thing about that is that we weren't exactly citizens of Dublin anymore. We couldn't really call ourselves citizens of Dublin, because we were just set adrift into the world. We were just everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And the only thing that connected us to other people were just the four of the lads in the band. That's what connected us and gave us a sense of home. I think in an odd sort of way, it can be related to the experience of emigration, you know. I think that, like, you go with your best mate to America, you move over to London, you go on tour with the band. I mean, it's not that different. Green would write in "Oh Such a Spring" off this album actually. Down by the docks, the weather was fine, the sailors were drinking American wine, and I wished I could go back to spring again. And I think that's quite indicative of that, you know. I think that maybe we were drinking American wine actually. But I think the experience of identity in different cultural contexts was a new thing for us. You know, Irishness means something different in America and Britain than it does in Ireland. In Ireland, it was the thing that always brought us all together and unified us, but in Britain, it would be the thing that made us different. And with Hero's Death, we were fighting ultimately to keep on to the myth, in a way, of Irishness that we were holding on to, and not just of Dublin, but the way we wanted to feel towards our life and that romance. But with Skinty Fia, we landed at, this is the album cover for Skinty Fia. Skinty Fia is our like bastardization of an Irish expression, Skinty Fia, which is something that the drummer in our band, Tom's great aunt, used to say when she'd bang her hand on the press, you know, it's like a curse. And it means damnation of the deer. But yeah, with this album, Skinty Fia, we landed into London as our base. We were settling there, and we were, you know, learning to experience this idea of Irish in London and in Britain, and which caused friction at some moments, honestly. Like, I mean, there was one time we were in the pub and a British guy came up to us and asked us, where did we put the bomb? Which was, you know, pretty fucked up, to be honest. But you know what? There was actually there was this story that really struck us. There's this like local Irish newspaper called the Irish Post in Britain. And there was a story about a woman called Margaret Keane who had died around the time of this. And she was living in Coventry. She died in Coventry and she wanted to be buried there with the inscription "In our Griha Gajo," in our Griha Gajo, which means in our hearts forever in Irish. And the local town council didn't want it to happen because they deemed it too political. The Irish language itself too political. This is just a woman who's being laid to rest by her family. It was a terrible shame and it really struck a chord with us, and we went on to write a song about it in our Griha Gajo, inspired by her, you know, in our hearts forever. It was a funny experience actually, because when we were recording that song, it was during COVID. We were on some farm somewhere, and I don't know, all of you remember COVID times. It was a bit strange, like getting pieces of news here and there. And we were in some car garage recording these like haunting backing vocals, trying to get the reverb right in our Griha Gajo. And we'd just done the minor part, and we came in and we got the news that they were actually going to allow the inscription. And then that was great because we were going to do the major part then. So we were kind of well prepared for that. It was, yeah. We ended up going to that grave in Coventry and visiting it and meeting the family and everything. It was an amazing experience to be witness to. And it helped us to gain a new perspective on Ireland and the injustices that had happened, you know, living in England. In spite of things like that might have happened, there were things that didn't happen in England and Britain that did happen in Ireland, and that was due to not just the British but to the Catholic Church. You know, a harrowing example of that down the road, not too far away, maybe 30 kilometres away from where Nikolai had been in Leenan and where I grew up, there's a town called Tuam in Galway. And a few years ago, there was a mass baby grave discovered there of 700 skeletons that the Catholic Church had hidden for years. It was all the babies probably of like unmarried women and that kind of thing. And what happens to the baby? Well, you assume it was adopted, right? Or you assume it was sent to England, but some of them were just buried. So it was a big tragedy to discover this, and yeah. It was something that, you know, inspired a song on our album Skinty Fia called "I Love You," which grapples with this idea of loving Ireland and hating Ireland at the same time. You know, we also heard this song. So the lyric goes like, "Selling genocide and half-cut pride, I understand. I had to be there from the start. I had to be the fucking man. It was a clamber of a life. I sucked the ring off every hand. Had 'em plying me with drink, even met with their demands. When the cherry lined up, I kept the spoilings from myself, till I had 30 ways of dying looking at me from the shelf. Cloud part and smile I had, a real good child I was. But this island's run by sharks with children's bones stuck in their jaws. Now the morning's filled with cokies trying to talk me through it all. Is your mommy Fine Gael? Is your daddy Fianna Fáil? And they say they love the land, but they don't feel it go to waste. Hold a mirror to the youth and they will only see their face. Yeah, there's a lot of rage and a lot of, it really reminded me of that song by Sinead O'Connor called Famine. And she released that song kind of in the 80s, actually. That's the grave, actually. Margaret Keane's grave. Sorry, I should have shown you that earlier. In Argreha Joe. And there's lovely Sinead O'Connor. He wrote the song Famine. A quote from Famine would be, I see the Irish as a race like a child that got itself bashed in the face. And if there ever is going to be healing, there has to be remembering and then grieving. So that there then can be forgiving, there has to be knowledge and understanding. And I think that we still very much carry the trauma of the past as a nation. There's a lot of friction between the actual spirit of the Irish people and the method of governance, which is closely modelled after the British system. Of course, there's the influence of the tech giants like Apple, Google and Meta, who all have their European bases in Dublin now, and Cork. This in a way continues like the control of sorts of like a mechanistic empire where it's just changed form, it's just changed form. It's in a very similar way to the introduction of alcohol to native peoples around the world by colonial powers to break our sense of unity and control over our own lives. Just this new generation doesn't drink as much; they're just using social media instead. However, their minds are still being dulled, but mostly their sense of ambition, to be honest. And I think it's grimly apt that these powerful companies have their bases in Ireland, like the test site for these kinds of control over many hundreds of years. And I think that although it's less visible and less obvious and more subtle, it's still shifting our minds to certain ways of thinking and to their whims, and it's making us better consumers, but it's also making us more polarized and less focused on more important values, I believe, like community and empathy. I believe that Ireland's survival, and that being not just politically but also spiritually, is down to our inherent tonality as a culture. We don't fully close the door on the past to dread the knocking at the chamber door. We let it in, and though it makes us melancholy and weary at times, it also connects us to each other and makes it an easy stretch of empathy to the people of other places. Our land still speaks to us. We try our best to understand its tones, much like a caring grandchild with an honest warmth growing from each beat we understand. I measure our understanding in not just our beliefs, but in our community and in our songs. The Dubliners characterising the rare old times, the Clancy brothers, the Irish-American experience. Maybe us Fontains lads found a kind of romance the modern world outside Ireland had left aside. Or maybe more so what we stumbled upon was that persistence to not give up in that sense of romance that we can pull from within ourselves. That way of soft belief and pride in country, that one that comes without hate. The love of the land and its good health. The terrains of both life and land. And that idea that though why we may never truly be, we yet still trip along disaster in the whirlwind of the free, through the terrains, the commonage of both life and land. That's all. That's everything. Oh yeah. All right. Oh yeah.
Thank you. I think we should go down here, Conor and I. But I will start out by not using the microphone and just let you in on who I am and why I'm here. Because maybe not all of you know who I am. Stephen Boyce, I'm associate professor here at the School in Landscape Architecture, teaching in landscapes. And also a bit of research now and then. But before we go into talking together, I have some questions I would like to also ask you. I would like to say thank you very much for this.
You're welcome, yeah, no problem.
I would say moving talk. It was very, very touching also. So I really, really appreciate that. And maybe that also changes a bit the questions I have prepared, at least some of them. But thank you very much, Conor, for. I would actually prefer to stand up with you, but let's sit here. Thank you very much. Even this, I mean, great artist, Sinead O'Connor.
Absolutely,
is
yeah.
with us now.
Yeah, God rest her soul.
Should we use the microphone? Now I'm looking at the.
All right, so do I turn this thing off then? Yeah. All right. Okay.
I think it's just me. Can you hear me in this microphone if I hold it closely to my mouth? I think I will actually start with an anecdote from my life.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing in the line of your talk here, and that's why I, on a personal level, actually, at least I believe, on a personal level, that I can somewhat understand the on the one hand grief, but on the other hand rebellion that you have presented here, right? The desire to really believe in the Irish culture. And that anecdote is from, as I said, my own life. I have a son. He's 22 years old now. And he just married last summer a wonderful girl from Kosovo, or her family is from Kosovo.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to the wedding in Brabrand last August in a big hall. And it was a Kosovo-Albanian wedding. And it touched me to the core because this room was filled with 200 Kosovo-Albanians who, how many years ago is that? That's in 92, 96. So we are speaking 25 years, 30 years ago, had to flee Kosovo because of the civil war that had broken out after the fall of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a particular moment, sorry, I will do it quickly, but it's just to really, I really think this is in line of what you have been presenting here, but in another context. There was a particular moment when the men in the audience, in the party, was invited to the singer. There was a Kosovo-Albanian band, also me, and we were seated in front of the scene on the floor, and they began singing. I didn't understand a single word, but I could hear, of course, in the music, but also in the song language that I didn't understand a word of, that it was a song of both really, really deep, what do you call that? Love, in the lack of a better word, for the country that they had to flee. But there was also, I really could see that in their eyes, a sense of pride and defiance when they sung of all these Kosovo-Albanian towns and landscapes that they had fled. Sorry. Right. So, yeah, that was the anecdote. It moved me to the core, really, to be part of that experience of somewhat getting the hardship, but also pride that this culture have gone through, or have, because of the history they have gone through. I hope it made sense. That was the anecdote.
It did, yeah. Thank
that
you for sharing.
It really was a touching experience. So I think what I would like to ask you about, for the first question is, maybe it has to do with that. Let me start there. I have several questions. It has to do with the relationship of, because what you have presented here is very much also based on I mean, the wonderful people in the Dubliners, it's also written and spoken words. So I wonder how you would, what role does music, I mean the sound, the tonality of a given song, play in relation to the written and spoken words? Can you have this sense of defiance and rebellion that you have spoken of, and can you communicate that without lyrics? That's what I'm trying to.
I mean, of course, yeah, absolutely. I think that, anyone who's had someone shout at them wordlessly would still be afraid, But no, I know what you mean totally. I mean, look, there's an inheritance of melody in Ireland that are often much, much older than the words, and the words get rewritten then and used for different purposes. Like even there's a song, Magillamar, which is an old Irish song in the Irish language. And it's the same melody pretty much as The Parting Glass, which is a famous song. And there are shared melodies, and oftentimes just a change of lyrics, but so sometimes it's really about that really deep feeling about that melody that kind of feels like it goes back through the generations like lightning or something. And sometimes it's just a vehicle for something that you're looking to say.
Great. I think of it because one of my big heroes so I'm a landscape architect. I'm by no means a musician, but I really, really like to listen to great music when I work, and also when, in many other occasions. But one of my great heroes is a former landscape architect, garden artist called C.T.H. Sørensen. And he made in 48 2 gardens on the heath of Jutland. One of them he called musical gardens, because of, in his mind, it was because of the way he used a really cutting into down to the basics of this project. Used one element that he repeated in different ways throughout the composition that he made. And for him, it was what he described as a musical garden. Another project he did in 48 at the same time was on a heath actually quite close to the musical gardens that he made. They were built later, different story. And there, this garden, a former memorial, has been described also as a musical garden by other landscape architects who have been reflecting on this project. And what he does there is, I would argue, in the line of what you have presented here, in the sense that he's like so you have this flat heathland. Some of you may know it, flat heathland, where he in an erosion valley makes just a very basic shape, almost as if he was a sound archaeologist, right? He pulls away all the unnecessary stuff to really invoke the sound of the landscape. That's why it's called a musical garden by someone. And I wonder if you should help us as designers. Now we are on a School of Architecture.
Mm-hmm.
If you should help us in at least relearning this ability to listen to landscapes like you have presented here, the capability of listening to the lay of the land, like C.T.H. Sørensen did in the heath in Jutland.
Mm-hmm.
That was the reason I brought him up. Where should we start? What would be your suggestion? What would be one of the things we could do?
I think one of the things that really strikes me, to be honest, as someone who lives in cities, is the behavior of animals in the cities. And I think that, you see that the change in the way that like urban foxes are behaving and stuff like that, but you also see birds and the disruption to their natural rhythms their confusion at car alarms and the natural lights and stuff. And when they start singing in the night, but actually there's something really interesting that's going on in Limerick in Ireland right now. I was made aware of it by Blind Boy Boat Club. I don't know if any of you know about him. He's an Irish podcaster, and essentially he was like talking about this district in Limerick City where there's like trees in the public spaces along the street, and it's one of the only places where there are trees like this. Now, the landscape of Ireland and of Limerick around that area was a lot of forestry before then. So the starlings would have been coming over to Ireland, whatever time of year that would be, and roosting in the trees and having somewhere to stay. But the trees have all been cut down. So the only place they can go to now is in the city centre in this one specific street that's tree lined. But it's a huge amount of them because they're used to coming over for however many years. So it's actually causing this issue with huge amounts of bird shit. And there's people slipping all over the place. So this whole thing is actually that this particular podcaster lives in Limerick still. He's made it a bit of his mission to try and get rid of all of this. And he's been getting a bit of stick off of the local Irish Limerick City Council or whatever for drawing attention to this huge issue, obviously, but like they don't like that. So he's actually even done research into how streets can be changed for like drainage and stuff like this. But anyway, the point is, what I'm trying to say is that I think that there should be trying to, as Nikolai demonstrates in his great work with Bruno Latour, that cities aren't separate from nature, that they're like a part of nature, and we have to encourage that kind of mindset and the recovery, in my opinion, of like the animals within and the wildlife within a city.
Yeah.
I kind of went on a tangent there. Does that connect to your question?
Yes. And maybe it actually led to I have another question that builds on that, because often when on your tours, I've noticed that you also introduce Nikolai and his book Land Sickness as a big inspiration. Maybe you can say a little bit about what is it with land sickness that has been such an inspiration, at least for the latest album, Romance.
Yeah, for sure. So what I really enjoyed, of course, many things that I enjoy about Nikolai's work, but about land sickness is how narrative it is, but how relatable it is. You know, I don't know if all of you here have read Nikolai's book, but the opening scene is like him waking up in a Paris apartment, and it's the summer in Paris, and it's so hot he can't sleep, and you know, maybe he's a slightly thinking in an obsessive way kind of person, but also it's very relatable to most people, is this concept of like, I turn on the fan to cool myself down, but I contribute to this increasing heat that's part of global warming. And so now he's like not just anxious because he can't sleep, he's anxious because he's reminded of the climate crisis. And it's that idea of how do we try and escape that. But I think that there's an anxiety to living in modern life, because it's so difficult to live ethically in modern life, in the way that we interact with the world via capitalism, whatever. And I think that in spite of like what other people might think about being in a band and stuff like that, and what things you might aim for, like trying to get money, trying to get prestige, or whatever goals you might think people have, ultimately the thing that started to hurt us was that somewhere along the line our sense of romance was starting to become damaged, and it was starting to impact our quality of life and our quality of appreciation of our life, because that's the thing that was really special about us as a group of people, to be honest. Not so much how good we were playing at a G chord or whatever, but actually that thing that we created together, like that sixth spirit in the room. There's 5 of us in the band, so sixth spirit in the room. And I think that, like, yeah, so what was I saying there? Yeah, I think that's what land sickness was really helping us with, was trying to find more language to, and it spurned on the inspiration to explore those themes ourselves.
Let's stay with Romance, because there's a song on Romance, which is your latest album. That's and really can really recommend it. There's a song there that describes your you could say experiences of modern life, as you just spoke about. called In the Modern World. And I noticed that on that song, you sing, or Brian does, I don't know who of you sings it, but there is a line where you says, and it's repeated now and again, that says that you don't feel anything in the modern world. I don't feel anything in the modern world. And my question is that, and maybe to build up on it, when I heard Romance for the first time, I felt something.
Great.
And especially in the opening song, Romance, which has that same title, because it builds up. It starts slowly, then it builds up and ends with this. And after seeing your talk today, I imagine at least that it's weather-beaten Irish landscapes. I mean, it really is a thunderous ending of Romance, which I really, really like. So I felt something and feel something when I listen to Romance. And if it's not, as you say, you don't feel anything in the modern world, if it's not a part of the modern world, then what world would you say Romance is part of?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think that I'm not joking, so don't be laughing, all right? But no, I think that it's interesting. You know, like this whole idea of like these billionaires and their concepts of like going to space, Mars, SpaceX, whatever, and the idea that Nikolai kindly shared with me at some point was this idea of like planet B. So we have planet A, we have plan A, plan B, planet A, planet B. Because they're, and you know, in some way it's probably to distract us from the like absolute swindling of the resources, right? You know, if they put our focus on the possibility that there's another world out there, but in actual fact, beyond all the spectacle of those claims, they are buying bunkers in New Zealand, you know, that they're going to live in when the shit hits the fan, and that is the real plan B, you know. So I think that ultimately, you know, when you're a songwriter, you're always exploring these ideas of not just your emotion, but like a world that you can retreat into. You know, it's a world you can create and retreat into. Maybe the real world isn't feeling safe to you, but maybe it's the place where you feel like you can express yourself and get your truth be told. And I think at a certain point, we were thinking, how far can we go with this? Can we retreat into this completely? Where can we go into the world? And we realized that we always kind of thought it was a place. We always thought it was Ireland. We always thought it was these things that were so symbolic to us. And of course they still are extremely meaningful to me. But I think that thing can be actually separated from a sense of identity or a sense of community and really boil down into the inner and to that persistence to keep the romance. And I think that, you know, short of like trying to go off to Mars or something like that and escape the world that we live in, we're more so trying to shift our perspective on how we view our own lives to something that makes us happier. Like,
great answer. So thank you. And actually, it also I would say my experience, both from listening to Romance, but in general listening to great music as a designer or as a landscape architect, is that it actually can inspire, I mean, hope, maybe that's not the right word, but it can help point a direction in what is otherwise a quite foggy and hopeless world we see emerging in front of us. So I think music, for me at least, can be the guide that somehow more or less directly, probably indirectly, I would say, keeps one on track. I mean, the generations before you in Ireland, it kept them on track despite the hardships that they were
Absolutely,
facing
yeah.
and working through, living through. And maybe it can also be one of the guides, I would say, that can help us, on course in what Latour calls new climatic regime, together with Nikolai. Community and empathy. Actually, maybe there was another thing which I actually thought of when we had the talk, and it was something maybe Nikolai addressed it.
About my dating profile.
Yeah, where can I find?
I'll give it to you
Where
later.
can the? It was Nikolai, actually, you Nikolai, who in your introduction of Conor, you mentioned Wittgenstein describing Ireland as the last, or place in Ireland, as the last pool of darkness in which he could find, could help him move forward. And I come to think of, this is not something I've prepared, but it has to do with this topic of darkness, like Wittgenstein describes here. Romance starts with, what is it? Into the darkness again, right?
Yes.
So why that start, into the darkness again? Building on Nikolai's introduction, is there something there with that darkness, or why?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that actually, when you make music, when you make art to begin with, it feels like such an amazing experience of expressing things to yourself. I think a lot of people start very young, so it starts off with very core experiences, and it feels very defined. But over time, over a career, over a few albums, you have to kind of find new places to go to and go deeper, and you often end up facing things maybe you don't want to face, such as like, and I love you, and these are like harsh things, and I think that there's a toll to it, to be honest. I think there is a toll, especially the idea of performing songs every night that you are facing these things in. And really, really giving yourself to it, not just like getting up and pretending, actually really feeling it, because people can tell the difference.
Yeah.
And that has a toll to it, I think, that Grian especially was experiencing after so much touring for Scintifia. And I think that in a large way, the song Romance, as it begins, into the darkness again, in with the pigs in the pen, it's like really directly addressing that.
That's another great answer, and I actually think that that's something we can use in the work we are doing here as well, because we are also staring into a darkness with the different crises that we are looking into, right? We are not sure of which way, so this is me reflecting on Nikolai's point and the start of Romance and your answer, that we are, as architects and landscape architects, we also now have to almost feel our way through the darkness that is in front of us. And the point about feel might be actually one of the key issues here that can bring in the reason why music and an attention to the tonality of landscapes makes sense, that it can actually be one of the aesthetic dimensions that can help us onwards. I come to think of, actually, this is not something I think of it now as well, that there is this listening to great music. This is me quoting a great landscape architecture critic called Elizabeth Meyer, that describes that when you listen to great music, you can sometimes feel this, like listening to Romance, this sense of goosebumps, right? You can get what she describes as aesthetic chills. It's in French, it's frisson, I think.
Lovely.
That's what she writes.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this feel, the need to use other senses than the visual sense. And hearing can be one of those senses that can maybe be a guiding light out of several others through this darkness that we are facing, I would say. Maybe we should. I don't. What does the time say? Now I'm looking at Nikolai. It says so. We have about. Do we have a few minutes for questions to the audience? I think that would be really nice if some of you have questions. Jens.
Well, I actually have two questions. One of them is. Hello.
Oh yeah.
I actually have two questions. One of them is very short and might render the other one obsolete. I don't know how well versed you are in the Irish language.
Not especially well versed, to be honest. I did learn it a bit in school, but I found it very difficult.
Yeah. So my question is, oftentimes you hear that occupying or occupying powers are eradicating native languages to sort of. It's in a very effective way of destroying the sort of spiritual connection to the land, but also a history and a culture. So it's a very effective, and you can understand why the Brits did that in Ireland as well. Luckily, they didn't succeed totally. So my question is, do you find that there is another relation or another spiritual, you might say, connection to country and land in the Irish language than there is in the English language?
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, thank you for your question. Yes, I think there is, of course. I mean, there's an amazing Irish writer, thinker, who unfortunately passed away recently after a short battle with cancer, called Manchán Magan. And yeah, he would explore these ideas. He has a book called like 30 words for rain. 30 words for rain, something like that. And in Ireland, it's one of those things, because it's so barren, the way the land. The rain, it comes down lightly, it comes down strongly, but it also comes from the side seemingly somehow as well, and all this kind of thing. And there's very exact words for all of these experiences, and there's very exact words for the feeling of missing someone, and the feeling of yearning for someone that you haven't seen in a while, and all these different words for the beach and everything. And the land is very much a topic of conversation in Ireland. It's something I learned actually only from leaving Ireland, is that talking about the weather is supposed to be boring, because it's actually really a way that people actually in Ireland are telling you about their inner emotional life somehow. About how their perspective is towards life, because the rain is always the same, but the person's perspective changes on it, and you can communicate something with that. But yeah, no, I would really love to see a resurgence of the Irish language in Ireland, specifically for those connections that it does give us. So I'm really excited for our new president, who is an amazing Gaeilgeoir, which is Irish for like Irish speaker, and to see what she brings to that. But thank you for your question.
Did it work? Maybe it was just how, as far as I understand, you've made some music with Kneecap as well, together.
Yes, Green actually made a song with Kneecap on their previous album, yeah.
Just how do you relate to their kind of telling of Irish history and their kind of fight for the Irish language as well? Or, and I don't know how well, or if you're friends, or how much you talk about these things. If you have some kind of reflection on their perspective, because they have a slight different, but if you're very generalistic, you maybe could put you in the same boat that.
Sure, yeah, I think that they have a different perspective by right of the specific circumstances into which they were born. They're from Belfast and we're from the Republic, and that is a very different experience of Irishness, of Irish Catholicism and everything, because it's so much more real, I think that there is a safety and a privilege to growing up in the Republic, because these are more conceptual things. A lot of this stuff, like the Catholic Protestant stuff, is in the past. Even though members of my family have experienced issues with that tension, but yeah. In terms of like their beliefs, in terms of like their views, of course, like I agree with absolutely most of them, fully. Like I think that we just have different ways that we go about sharing them with the world, both of which are kind of effective in their own ways.
Thanks. We have another question here.
Yeah, thanks. So there's this thing of music of a place. When you spoke about your first record and Dublin, in a way, what I heard you say was it was the music of that place at that time. Maybe in history, of course, your experiences, but in a way, it reflected how it was living on the streets, etc. I think it's interesting because in sort of musical history, there's also these different instances. For instance, the Chicago blues, and that would be the music of special conditions in Chicago at that time, and you would have, the post-punk and Joy Division in Manchester, etc. And then in this kind of literature, I've heard it claimed that after the internet, this kind of relation is impossible. The black musicians in Chicago, they were in, and the Irish people making this folk music they couldn't leave, basically. They were there all their lives. But after the internet and after sort of global travel, this intimate link between a musical expression and then a place is impossible because you have so much influences. YouTube coming in. Do you have any reflections on that? Can you tell a little bit more about that?
Totally, yeah. I think it's probably more indicative of maybe like white people's exposure to the multicultural that existed anyway. I think that probably we were able to much more live in a bubble and pretend that this was the only form of culture that was going on. But now in the internet, with the like radical giving of voices to people, we're able to see the world as it truly is. And I think that there was always very interesting mixing of cultures going on in music and in art. And we can see that even in like two-tone, if you're familiar with two-tone. Or anything that happened in Britain in the last 100 years. It was amazing. So yeah, I would say that probably. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes.
Hiya. I was curious. You talked about the British, in the 19th century and the 20th century, but in your own lifetime, you briefly mentioned upon the tech influx in recent years. And one of the things that happened in late 1990s, probably, Ireland got more than €1 billion to build, motorways and change, the landscape in that way. So I was wondering, in your own lifetime, how you felt the culture changed because of this influx of tech and capital, and basically infrastructure all over Ireland.
Totally. Okay, so when I was a child, there was a road on the motorway I lived on the west coast in Castlebar, and there was some changes, obviously, like millennial person, so that's the whole fucking beating the bell of that. But yeah, so there was a sign, and it used to say miles on it, and then it said kilometers on it, and then we got, and then the drive to Dublin used to be really long. It used to be like 6 hours, and then it changed to being nearly just about 3. So there was accessibility regarding that. That did change things. I think that Ireland used to be more village orientated and community orientated. There was a thing in Ireland with these country bands that used to go out around, and people used to play music, and that was happening even in Ireland, because Ireland was like technologically behind Britain. So there was things happening in Ireland, like looking at the old family pictures of like my parents' generation or just before, it looks like a proper time warp. Like, the 80s look like the 70s, the 60s look like the 40s. It's really bizarre. And yeah, so even my uncle was going around playing in these show bands and these dance halls like all around, and I don't know, that was an era. That was definitely an era of being village orientated, and I think that as well there was a lot of factories and things like that. Like my town, this sounds so ridiculous, right? But my town actually had a hat factory. I don't know how that works, to be honest. I've thought about that one before. But yeah, it was abandoned when I was growing up. But it was indicative of that change that we've seen all over Europe, right? Of these increased labour costs, these moving of construction to like different places, like in Asia and everything, and what it does to a town and what it does to the spirit of a town, and also the increase in like things like supermarkets, which seemed great at the time because we could get so much more for the money. But then like obviously then the local things closed down, and then the supermarkets and the supply and everything is connected globally, and then you know you're kind of you've no mate who owns a shop who's going to be all right with you then, like. And regarding the tech stuff, I think it's just showing a really clear example of the exchange of funds from public money into the hands of private corporations. Like, you know, Ireland won't collect the tax bill because they're afraid these big companies are going to leave ultimately, and with that they just increase their profit, you know. And most of them don't even fucking make anything. They literally don't. What is Instagram like? Just a platform, like. I'm not getting a fucking burger from that, like, am I? Sorry, but yeah. Anyway, thanks for your question.
Last question for this gentleman.
Thank you very much. And glad I got in for the last question. I'd like to hear something hopeful. I think I really appreciate everything you've said, and it's really, really nice to hear all of these stories of Ireland, and you bringing them here, you bringing them to this crowd, and introducing, you know, some really great characters, some really great art. I'd like to hear very simply, you know, what are your own hopes through the music that you're continuing to make. You know, what do you hope for Ireland? That's a very big question, but hopefully you have some hope.
Yeah, I absolutely do. You know, of course, it's a heavy topic, Irish history. It's always going to be. It's always going to have these seriousnesses with it. To be honest, at certain points of speaking, I was kind of like, this is maybe a bit heavy for the uninitiated Danish people. But no, I'm really grateful for all of your patience and your attentiveness during this lecture. But I would actually say, my hope is honestly to just like personally as a band to continue to carrying like social and political messages that we have been trying to carry. I feel like that fills me with hope to be able to turn a platform that we made, like a band, of course, music that we made, to some cause that's worth something, you know. I feel like that we find a reason for our voices in that, and something to do with, you know, with it. And that inspires in a bizarre way, because of course, like, there are some very bleak situations, but on a personal basis, it does inspire us with hope, because it makes us feel like we can do something with it. And it's not something that's just linked to someone who's like in a band that's doing all right, you know what I mean? I think that anyone can really do that. I think you can fill yourself with taking control of your own actions and your own possibility for actions and beliefs, and to really to engage with them, to actually do it. Don't just sit there and you know, think that you're like a good person. Do you know what I mean? I hope that was hopeful-ish, was it? All right, okay, sound.
I think that was actually a great way to end this wonderful session and talk with you, Conor. So thank you for taking your time to be here and indulging us in your thinking and in your music.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, and with Senator O'Connor as backdrop, I have to also remind everyone here that on the 12th, November the 12th, we have another Live Terrains lecture by Martin Rauch, this time, working with earthworks. Maybe some of you already know him, but he will be here on November the 12th, so please pay attention to that, and you're all welcome, of course, to that lecture as well. Thanks. Have a great evening.